Again, is this...
If all of the individual incidents and artifacts that you mentioned were not in this case, and if the university were a state university that never practiced segregation, would you say that the case would come out differently?
It may, Your Honor, and that's how and why we should not have an across-the-board policy that all of a sudden jettisons the important limited consideration of race that this court has approved.
So you would perhaps endorse a system in which a state university in a state that never had de jure segregation would be prohibited from doing what North Carolina is doing?
Yes, because the important point here is whether or not the educational benefits of diversity have been established by that particular university. And so here at the University of North Carolina, of course, it matters a lot because it affects recruitment and retention and the like. But at another university where it may not have been, a part of its history, it's still the important piece here is whether or not the university itself can establish its own educational benefits of diversity and satisfy that through narrowly tailored means. The University of Michigan, in the Gritter case, is a good example of that. I won't pretend to know the history of the state of Michigan, and I know that they were fraught with, desegregation problems themselves, within districts, but whether or not that was a remnant of the state's own de jure segregation, I don't know, but that would be a good example.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. You've mentioned the benefits, of course, in diversity, but amici on the other side have argued that one consequence of the school's consideration of race is that it sends the message that race is something you should consider down the line. In other ways, student activities, other sorts of areas, that they get the message from the beginning, race counts, and they carry that forward into other areas where there may not have been a history of discrimination that would, in your terms, justify it. Do you have a response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. The research, and there's some of the research that is shown, and I apologize if the court isn't quite getting here, but what I understand the court is inquiring about is, some of the particular stigma that might be attached to...
No, it was the fact that the school is telling students race matters in admissions, and that the students may learn from that lesson that race should matter in other areas where perhaps it doesn't have the same justification as it would have under your view on admissions.
Yes, so 2 points, Your Honor. One is that there's no evidence in this case of the University of North Carolina's own decision to enact race-conscious admissions had led to any negative consequences, much less the negative consequences that you've shared here.
Do you know, and this may be an unfair question, is race a consideration in the formation, other types of activities that students are engaged in? I get the sense from the briefs anyway that race permeates a lot of what happens at the university, and you're shaking your head in a way that you don't agree with that.
Well, Your Honor, it is a bit of reminds me of a storybook when I was a child, Henny Penny and the Sky's Falling argument, because they're blaming that just about everything is caused by race-conscious admissions. But in fact, if you look at the research, for example, on the issue of stigma, both internal and external stigma, and this is referenced in the AERA brief, it actually shows that race-conscious admissions programs at universities that have race-conscious admissions programs actually have lesser degree of stigma attached, both internal for the student and external, what they're hearing from other students, than states with bans on...
Counsel,
I'm sorry.
I'm not talking about stigma. I'm talking about student groups taking its cue from the university and saying, we ought to take race into account when whatever we're doing.
And again, Your Honor, there's no evidence in this case of how that correlates to any consideration of race at UNC or any other university.
General, you have emphasized the service academies today, and you did in your brief, and government counsel in Grutter did as well. Are you linking yourself to Harvard and UNC? In other words, you rise or fall with their case?
Well, Mr. Chief Justice, we certainly think that it's critically important for universities throughout the nation to be able to prioritize the educational benefits of diversity, and the ROTC programs are also a compelling interest for us here that exist at those civilian institutions. But I guess if what you're asking me is whether we think the military has distinctive interests in this context, I would say yes, and I think it's critically important for the court in its decision in these cases to make clear that those interests are I think, truly compelling with respect to the military.
So in that situation, I suppose it depends how significant you think those distinctions are. It might make sense for us not to decide the service academy issue in this case?
Well, I would certainly ask the court to take account of those distinctive interests and I think to recognize the compelling interest and the critical national security interest that I think.
I guess I'm saying I would have thought that you might want to distinguish yourself in order to preserve arguments that are particularly applicable, if there are such arguments, to the service academies, rather than take the position here, which is you're going to be bound by whatever we say with respect to the other universities.
Well, it is critically important to the military to be able to achieve diverse student bodies in the service academies, but it's also critically important because actually more officers come from ROTC programs to try to protect and preserve space for universities to also achieve the educational benefits of diversity and provide the path to leadership that inhere in those programs as well.
We'll get to you in a moment. There's been a lot of talk about African American applicants to Harvard in sort of a general, indistinguishable way, when in fact they cover a very broad swath of applicants.
Of course.
What do you do with respect to an African American applicant? I mean, you're concerned about diversity of viewpoint. Let's say his viewpoints tend to be very close to, the white applicants. He grew up in Grosse Pointe, had a great upbringing, comfortable. His parents went to Harvard. He's a legacy. And yet, under your system, when he checks African American, he gets a tip. He gets a benefit from that. Isn't that very stereotypical under the Harvard program?
I think it's well, first of all, it is simply not the case that every black applicant gets a, quote, tip. In fact, I'll direct the court's attention to page 1,811 of the joint appendix, which includes this beautiful chart, which represents an undisputed model of the relative importance of race on application outcomes. And the one that you cannot actually even see to your far right is race. Race explains.
I can't see it because it's far away.
Nonetheless, you have
it
the
is
page
not
reference.
zero.
It is very close to zero. That is, the testimony in the case
Well,
was.
so there's only a little racial discrimination in the case.
Are you asking me whether Harvard is, you're asking me to answer a question that assumes that Harvard is discriminating on the basis of race? No, I can't accept that.
Well,
what Harvard
isn't that
says
what is, Mr. Waxman, isn't that what the case is about, the discrimination against Asian Americans?
There was count one of the complaint was that Harvard was intentionally discriminating against Asian Americans. The entire evidence of that case, all of the plaintiff's proof, was that Asian Americans are treated worse than white applicants. That is, that there was prejudice, intentional discrimination. The evidence could not more soundly have refuted that.
What do you do with the charts? What do you do with the charts in their brief? I think they're on page 24 or 43, the academic decile and the comparative treatment of African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans. You don't see a surprising disparity in that?
So there's a lot to be said about that, but I guess the first thing I would say about that chart is that their own expert agreed that because that chart is simply a descriptive statistic, it is, quote, not equal to evidence of discrimination. It reflects a pattern which might or might not be real. Now, understand that that chart that they've displayed for you, they have eliminated all ALDC applicants. So 1/3 of the admitted class over 6 years, they're not even in that chart. That chart is predicated on something called an academic index. An academic index is a formula that looks at two things: high school grades and test scores.
And so people in the different racial categories, they have a different result based on other factors, which include race.
They have a different result because among the many, many, many characteristics of any particular individual applicant that Harvard considers, one that it does not consider is the academic index. That is the very metric that they're displaying for you. Harvard doesn't even use the testimony in the case was the only reason that the academic index is even calculated is because the Ivy League athletic rules require that your recruited athlete class, the AI for your recruited athlete class, not be more than 2 standard deviations below the
Mr. Waxman,
matriculating class last year.
Put aside the hypothetical about the African-American applicant who's a legacy. Take 2 African-American applicants in the same category, however you want to take it. They both get, or both can get, a tip, right, based on their race. And yet they may have entirely different views. Some of their views may contribute to diversity from the perspective of Asians or whites. Some of them may not. And yet it's true that they're eligible for the same increase in their opportunities for admission based solely on their skin color.
So the point—
That was a question.
No, I know. I'm attempting to answer your question. There is no doubt that as the testimony showed, that for applicants who are essentially so strong on multiple dimensions, so extraordinarily strong on multiple dimensions, that they are sort of on the bubble, that they're a real candidate for admission, being African-American, or being Hispanic, or in some instances being Asian American, can provide one of many, many tips that will put you in.
People say that, yes, but you will have to concede that if it provides one of many, then in some cases it will be determined.
I do concede that.
Okay, so we're talking about race as a determining factor in admission to Harvard.
Race for some highly qualified applicants can be the determinant factor, just as being an oboe player in a year in which the Harvard-Radcliffe Orchestra needs an oboe player will be the tip.
We did not fight a civil war about oboe players. We did fight a civil war to eliminate racial discrimination, and that's why it's a matter of considerable concern. And I think it's important for you to establish whether or not granting a credit based solely on skin color is based on a stereotype when you say this brings diversity of viewpoint. It may not bring diversity of viewpoint in a particular case at all.
Well, number one, viewpoint diversity, while Harvard values it and seeks it, is not the only by far the only reason for wanting a genuinely diverse class. We want a diverse class for backgrounds and interests and lots of things other than just viewpoint. If we were to use, for example, the example that has been discussed, I believe, for every other advocate that has stood up this morning, and ask, what about taking race into account if the student writes about it? The fact of the matter is Harvard is attempting not to have among a class that is diverse among many generations, a class that is racially diverse only for people for whom their racial identity and their racial experiences is of such compelling importance that they write about it. Right? Your hypothetical about the black student who may have very different views than the stereotype of what a black student will have is in fact the subject of that's discussed in the Corona report. The Corona report gave, in its analysis of the importance and dimensions of diversity, an actual example that came from Richard Light's book, published book, which had a particular class. It happened to have 3 African-American students in it. An African-American student gave an answer in a discussion, which another African-American student said, "That is not my view. My view is quite the opposite." And a third one said, "I wasn't actually going to say anything, but I have a completely different view." That was an incredible learning experience, not only for the non-African Americans in the discussion, but for them. And that's what Harvard is trying to get at. I'm sorry for taking so long.
No, I appreciate your answers.